I would like to introduce Professor Shankar. Professor Shankar is a Professor of Information and Communication Studies and Head of School at University College Dublin in the School of Information and Communication Studies. And her title is Digital Curation, Professional Education and Training in Ireland and Needs Analysis. Professor Shankar.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak today. This project is developed over the last couple of years with my colleague, Dr. Amber Cushing, who's a lecturer at our School of ICS at UCD as well. So to give you an overview, we're going to talk briefly about what definitions exist out there of digital curation and what has been going on in the last, say, decade, 15 years in the area of education in this space, and how and why Amber and I translated that into a research project specifically to look at needs analysis here for what kind of training needs to exist. We've developed some larger issues as well. If you want to hear more about this, our paper was just published, I guess it was just published in February earlier this year in the Archives and Records Journal. So I'm pulling from that paper. So there's been a lot of definitions of digital curation, and the ones that I kind of work with and Amber works with, this idea of digital curation from Abbott as the management and preservation of digital material to ensure accessibility over the long term. And Jeanette Bastian and her colleagues picked this up a few years later to really talk about more processes that are part of this digital curation umbrella: the creation, maintenance, preservation, dissemination, and exhibition of trusted bodies of digital information for current and future use. And all of those terms actually have meaning, that the information that we store digitally has to be trusted, and that there are multiple processes that need to go into making such information trustable and trustworthy. So with that framework, have the, what might be familiar to many of you, the Digital Curation Center in the UK has developed what they call a digital curation life cycle. There are simplified versions of this, but if you look at it, and it's a little hard to read, the innermost circle working with the actual data, the preservation planning, etc., are the processes that happen on an almost daily basis. And as we go out from that inner core towards things like migration, reappraisal, conceptualization, and disposal, we're talking about processes that need to happen less often. So again, the core is what happens the most often, where we're describing, representing metadata, et cetera, going out to preservation, curation, which happens slightly less often, storage, et cetera, to those processes in the very outer ring that happen much less often. So these are sort of the underpinning of what the framework for digital curation is. So we then decided to start taking a look at digital curation education. And what we found is that a lot of the programs, the frameworks, the tools even have been developed primarily in the US in schools of information and library studies. University of North Carolina has an exemplary program. Simmons College, soon to be Simmons University in Boston is another one, and so forth. We found fewer models that were appropriate for the European educational context. The DigCurve project is a notable exception to that rule. So we ended up with, here's this body of knowledge, body of work that has been going on in this space, digital curation, for 15 years. Here are ways that people have been teaching this subject, but yet they don't quite fit together for our context in Ireland. So what we set out to ask was, what are the digital curation skills, needs, challenges in our context, and not just here in the Republic, but in the North as well? And how can we integrate them into an effective educational model? Obviously, we have skin in the game. We are a School of Information and Communication Studies, and we wanted to create what would become basically the first digital curation offerings, teaching offerings, suite of programs in the Republic and in the North. But we wanted to do it on a basis of evidence and research. So with funding from the Archives and Records Administration of the UK and Ireland, they have a a grant program, which I encourage you. It's a small amount, but definitely worth applying for, about £2,500 to do a research project. So we got funding from them in 2015, and the first step was using the work that we had already been building on this literature review. We created a 64-item online questionnaire of digital curation needs and skills derived from the literature. Some of you may have actually participated in this online survey. We followed up the next year based on that analysis with semi-structured interviews with Irish-based professionals who either in their own institutions had been doing what we call digital curation, whether they called it that or not, or certainly were familiar with it or had need of it in their institutions and organizations. We then extracted from that to say, all right, now we know what the needs and skills are. What's the best way to deliver this education, or this training and teaching? So we came up with a much more abbreviated survey to get a sense of, should this be in person, through workshops, online, what would work for the context that we find ourselves in and our colleagues find ourselves. So this is sort of the structure of the research that we did. Okay. So just to give you a sense of our response rate, so we sent this out to, I would say about I can't remember now, I should have written this down, probably about 150 people, 200 people. So we got a pretty good response rate, almost 50%, which is amazing for these kinds of questionnaires. And we did 9 semi-structured interviews. Maybe because it was only 10 questions, last year's survey, we got 164 responses with a similar set. So we're pretty happy with the level of engagement of the professional community. I think we got a very nice representative sample. So as you can see, this gives you a sense of where most of our respondents were self-identified from. Third level education, I would say university libraries were a significant part. Surprisingly and interestingly, county council folks working in the county councils were our second biggest population of respondents, with a kind of even public, nonprofit, cultural heritage, government, and even the commercial and private sectors as well. So that gives you a sense of who our respondents actually were. One of the questions we asked, I mean, obviously this is pretty selective. I'm just picking out some of the more interesting findings from our study. If you want to learn a bit more, you can look at the paper that we did for more information. About 53% said, we asked people, who was responsible for maintaining digital information? And we left it kind of just there, maintaining digital information. So about half the people who responded said that there was another unit that was responsible, and a good third said they also used cloud storage to do this. What's kind of disturbing is 70% of our respondents said they never run maintenance checks on their own machine. So somebody else is supposed to be responsible. It wasn't particularly clear if those other somebodies actually did that work or not. So that's a little bit about the technical nature of what many of us and you are all working in. So we asked a little bit more about disaster planning, which is on that outer ring, things that you hope never happen. Less than 50% of our people said they actually have a disaster plan. I'll just take a rough straw poll. How many of you know of a disaster plan for digital assets in your organizations? Okay. How many of you have ever actually read that plan? And how many of you have actually been responsible for actually implementing that plan or even writing it? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you all are respondents, as you can see. So about 50% said they don't have a plan, and 60% said they never reviewed it if they did have one. Okay. So we asked about the digital curation life cycle, and as you can see, about good 40% had never heard of this. And these, remember, were individuals who were actually, kind of involved in various activities related to digital curation in Ireland. Got a tiny percentage that either were like, I think I might have heard about it, and a very, similar percentage who said they were very familiar with it. But really, the vast majority of people were either aware or not even aware of what's going on. So that was about 78%. The rest fell. But at least got 20% that were somewhat clued in. So then we switched to CPD. And we took a look at what kinds of CPD options were available, professional development materials and websites. And we found that social media, actually, some people use daily, 26% thereabouts, went for how often do you read development materials. But if you look at the chunk, a few times a year to a few times a month is when people really engage continuing professional development. Whether it's reading professional development journals, articles, etc., social media, or websites, say for Digital Curation Center, Digital Preservation Coalition, and the like. There are many more questions related to things like online webinars and so forth. So we're all just kind of right in that middle space, not really able to do as much as maybe we'd want to. So then we actually delved into what, during the interviews, what digital curation is. And going back to what the Bastian and Abbott definitions gave us on the left, management and preservation over the long term of trusted information. So you're talking again about life cycle, multiple processes. But if you look at the right side, the kind of comments we got back from our respondents are, well, a couple of them: sustainable preservation of work, management and preservation and digitization, put on a computer somewhere. Ooh, okay. And then digitized collections available, storage comes up. Okay. So there's a bit of a disconnect going on. Because, and this is when anyone who has ever been a student of mine, I actually make my students repeat this en masse in class while I conduct. Repeat after me. Digital curation does not equal digitization. And yet, that's a lot of what we were getting. As long as we digitize the materials, we've done our curation job. There's a lot more to it than that, for obvious reasons. So then, going back to the interviews, what did we get? We got a lot of very fragmented and incomplete definitions compared to what might be extant in the published literature. So we then tried to delve into some of their work practices that were actually happening. So one of our respondents said they were going to be establishing an archive and records group to try and tease out some of these issues. But what is interesting is what's actually happening on the ground. You got one person who knows what they're doing, and then 4 or 5 other colleagues who think about this. And he or she said, well, guess what? I'm going to get overruled because they just aren't going to listen to me. So this came up a lot in the interviews, that people who are doing this work have to educate their colleagues about what they're doing. And they also need to educate administration at the higher levels about why digital curation matters. It's not a matter of just putting things on computers and hoping that they last, right? So that was kind of an interesting finding as well. So then the last component of our project, I guess the most recent component, was the follow-up survey. What's the best way to get this information to you? Overwhelmingly, online course and digital stewardship, digital curation, etc. And learning the skills and knowledge of how to actually work with different tools to do everything from ingest to preservation and reuse all along the way. So that's huge. So for us, as educators and as a School of Information, where did that leave us? Let's see. One is there are significant lacuna that we found in communication. There is a consistent lack of understanding of what these processes actually are that are part of digital curation. Not surprisingly, given the size of our profession here, many have only maybe one or no experts, and they're often very self-taught, and they have a tough time communicating why they do what they do to their colleagues. It also looks different in Ireland. This is probably our most interesting finding. People in Ireland do not call digital curation. Our colleagues in the UK do, maybe because of the advocacy work of the Digital Curation Center. We tend to call it all kinds of other things. This term digital curation seems to have a lot more purchase in North America, the UK, and Europe than it does in Ireland. But people are doing the same things. They are digitizing, preserving, storing, developing data plans, et cetera, et cetera. They're just not calling it digital curation. There's also the body of literatures to work with. We're very North American centric, Not surprisingly, they're the biggest players in this space. And they all assume that we all understand and are working from the same page when it comes to digital curation. This was also very interesting and possibly not, I don't know if unique is the right word, but I think it's very endemic in our context, is that there is a significant amount of in-reach that needs to be done. That is communicating to our colleagues in our own administration, whether you're working at a local council that wants to make data open or you're working at a university library. So they have to engage with other people, develop these communities of practice, work across their institutions just to educate their own colleagues and administrators. So how did we tackle this? We have had a digital curation postgraduate degree and graduate certificate on the books for the last couple years. But this year, based on this work, we finally sort of put it all together and said we need to change the name, we need to change the focus. So starting in this coming autumn will actually be digital information management, because that's actually more of what we're doing. And that way people across different sectors may actually find a different home within this program, whether they're working in the commercial sector, whether they're working in university or cultural heritage and such organizations. Okay. So again, we have several different offerings. And I just mentioned the tracks to optimize, because again, we found that people, whether you're coming from the private sector, the cultural heritage sector, or the higher education and civil service, had different interests and needs. And we now are able to track those a bit better based on when people come in and which modules they choose to take. This will be an option going forward starting this coming year. We also realize there's a crying lack of CPD offerings in this space. So starting this autumn, we're offering a 15-credit professional certificate, 2 modules, online option, though you do have an accelerated class lecture meeting option as well, so you can choose. And that way, those who are working professionals who already have postgraduate training in librarianship or a related field will be able to come and just focus on what we think was, we learned was missing from the profession. Okay. And this is important for the Irish context. We're actually going to be having one of those modules specifically focusing on in-reach and outreach. That is, how do you communicate to your colleagues? And second, now that you've got all this lovely digital information, how do you send it back out to the world? Okay. So that leaves me there, and I will be taking questions along with everybody else in the panel. So thank you for your time. And I do have flyers related to our programs if anybody wants to get one. I've put a few around earlier, but I'm carrying a few with me as well if you get a hold of me at lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana.